Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another Mod with me, where we create a deep and meaningful bond with the cards through creative expression and deck modification. Today we are going to be trimming two of my fairy decks. This is the Tarot of a Secret Forest, and this is actually one of my favorite little decks. But this is a deck that I read very much intuitively. It has reversed images on the back. I do have a complete review on this deck that talks a little bit more about how I use it, because I do make use of both sides of this deck for my readings. But because I do read it more intuitively, I don't tend to pay any attention to the assigned associations to the card. I'm just looking at this beautiful artwork, and that is really what I'm sinking into and where I'm getting my messages. And for the most part, I just find these symbols to be a distraction. So this is Los Garabio's kind of newer take on numbering their cards, or naming and numbering their cards, which is an improvement over the 4 or 5 different multiple languages on a card. This is definitely an improvement, but I'm just not really a huge fan of these symbols with the numbers. I just really wish they would just do nice borderless cards with the simple title at the bottom, like a lot of the newer decks coming out from like Llewellyn and US Games and things like that. So I really wish Los Garabio would kind of get on board and do that as well, but that one's flipped over. So because I read with this deck really intuitively, and because I tend to find the symbols distracting, like actually pulling my eye away from the artwork, I'm actually going to trim this deck down completely borderless just to the artwork. So alongside the Tarot of the Secret Forest, which is one of my favorite decks to do intuitive readings with, this is a deck that for me is very emotionally driven, and it really gets deep down into those dark and shadowy places. Not that I would really call it a shadow deck, but for me, well, I think any deck can actually be a shadow deck, but for me, this is really about tapping into the underlying emotional energy of a situation, and that's really what this deck does for me. It goes down into the deep and dark places. To balance that out, I recently purchased the Fairy Lights Tarot. And again, this is by the same artist, so the art style is very similar, which I really, really like. I just love these expressive images. Again, I'm finding the same issue where I'm just distracted by these weird kind of clip arty symbols just plunked down into the card. And I think it's much more noticeable in this deck than even in this deck, because this deck, at least for the most part, the, if I can find a minor, maybe it might be the black background versus the lighter colored background, but for the most part, the majority of the symbols stay within the border, and they're not overlapping the images so much as they do in this deck. And then we have these weird dots and this extra white border, and it's so much to distract from this beautiful artwork that I'm just not really loving the way that it's working for me in terms of that aesthetic. So again, I'm finding them very distracting, so I think I'm going to also take this one down. I thought about actually writing the suit associations on these cards, because these ones I do tend to read a little bit more in line with traditional tarot, but again, it's just kind of it is more of an intuitive deck for me, and whereas this kind of digs deep into those dark and shadowy places, I feel like this kind of brings it back up into the light, and I think that they're going to read really beautifully together. Let's just see here. You know, they look beautiful together. I mean, look how gorgeous. But now just imagine without those borders on there, with all of this extra distracting clip arty elements that really, I think, take away from the stunning beauty and aesthetic of this artwork, really. I think once we take off that kind of cheesy clip art, we're going to be left with these really gorgeous pieces of intuitive art that I think is just going to read really beautifully. So I am just going to go ahead and take the borders off of both decks. And because these are decks that I do use together, I actually blackened this one because I for a long time I was like, I'm just gonna leave it because it's fine, and you know, I don't have to look at the numbers and the symbols on it. I can just ignore it. But really I can't. They're very distracting, and I think they pull away from the power of the images. So even though I did take the time to actually edge this deck, I am going to cut all that off now. I did edge it a long time ago, so it's not like it was recently edged, so I feel kind of okay about doing that. So anyway, because I do work with these two decks together, because they are decks by the same artist and the trimming style is going to be really similar, I thought we'd just go ahead and do them together in one video. The one thing that I'm going to have to take into consideration is the symbols on the bottoms that tend to overlap the images in some places. So I'm going to have to make sure I'm allowing for that. I would like to get these decks all to the same size. So I think what I'm going to do is cut, and this is going to be a lengthy process, but you know, I'm committed to making these two decks work for me because I really do enjoy working with them. So I think what I'm going to do in order to get them to be the exact same size is to actually do both decks one side at a time. So this is going to be a lengthy process. I will definitely speed it up for you all so you don't have to sit and watch me go through the whole thing card by card, 78 cards times 2. That's a lot of cards, so I'm going to be here for a while. The only other thing that I need to keep into consideration is that the back of this deck actually does have images that I do work with. But I do believe that the borders are fairly close. So I think that should be fine. And this one, the borders are thinner on the back. So whenever I trim off of the front is going to automatically take the back down to just the artwork. So that will be fine. So let's go ahead and get started on trimming two of my favorite fairy decks. So the first thing that I'm doing is just dividing all of the decks up into their suits and then the measures. And I'm just mixing the two decks together because I want to make sure that when I'm cutting each of these decks, and because I do want them to be all the same size, so I'm cutting them all at the same time, I do want to make sure that I am allowing to cut off the clip art, this suit symbols that are on each card. So I'm just dividing them up to get all of them grouped together so that I can make sure that I'm getting all of them off, because as you can see, like the pentacles overlap the images more than the wands do. So I want to make sure that I am allowing enough, trimming off enough to get that pentacle off there. And I think that the pentacles, so I think the wands on both decks, the wands don't really come into the artwork, so that one's going to be fine. These swords just barely come into the artwork, more so on the fairy lights, so we'll have to keep that in mind. The pentacles definitely come up into the artwork on both of these. I do need to check the backs, which I think look like they are the same, in the same places on the front, so that works just fine. And I do believe that the cups are the ones that come up the furthest into the artwork on both decks. So I think this symbol is the tallest. So I think this is the cup that I'm going to use to start with. Let's just go ahead and measure. So that one comes up a 1/2 inch into the card. This one comes up a 1/2 inch into the card. Let's just double check our lines here. 1/2 inch into the card. And a 1/2 inch into the card on those. I'll have to measure the tops because, as you can see, the tops do have more overlay on the quartz, on the fairy lights. So we'll have to look at that when we get to the tops. We are going to start with the bottoms because I know that that's the largest chunk that needs to be taken off. And for the majors on both of the decks, the numbers don't come into the artwork at all, so we'll be able to just cut those using the same measurements that we do with everything else. So we're going to start with the cups and then move to our swords. Oh, sorry, our pentacles, our swords, and our wands. So we're just basically going to go down to however much I need to take off here, which is going to be about a 1/2 inch. And then we'll do our majors. And this is what we're going to trim today. All 4 sides, one at a time. This is going to be a project. This may take me more than a day. We'll have to see. They look kind of cool like that though, don't they? Kind of a gray. I mean, this is just, I haven't edged the fairy lights or anything. It just looks kind of grayish. Gray with the black. Anyway, this deck is going to get really small by the time I'm done. So it's going to be, you know, basically just this size in here. I can cut pretty much right to the edge of all of these. When we get to the sides, we'll take a look at that, but we're going to cut the bottom and then the top first because those are where our symbols are. But this is definitely going to be a pocket deck when I'm done, which is totally fine because I like bigger decks I like smaller decks anyway, and then I can, you know, use it to make much larger spreads if I wanted to. Especially because I am mixing in 2 decks here. So let's go ahead and figure out our measurements for the bottom and get started on that. Okay, so we are going to start with our bottoms first, and I always like to turn my deck facing the side that I'm going to be working on first. That way I'm always grabbing and moving to the board towards the side that I'm cutting. That way I don't accidentally flip things around, because if I don't use my exact measurements, then I'm not going to get an exact cut. So these cards are roughly 4 3/4 of an inch long. So if I go down to 4 1/4, that is not going to be far enough. These are going to be tiny cards when I'm done. So we're going to have to move down sometimes because it's hard to see where my blade is going to hit. You can kind of, this excess little edge here is about the width of my ruler. So if I set my ruler right here, I know you guys can't see this because I'm on the wrong side of the camera, but if I set my ruler right here, I can determine exactly where my blade is going to hit. So if I go, I hate being in between lines, but if I go right here, I'm not going to quite get the top of that cup. So we're going to have to go right here, and that is going to get me where I need to be roughly. Now we play the washi game. So, and then I moved it. Doesn't that figure? Let's try that again. Okay, that should be right. So I've just used a piece of washi tape to kind of tuck that down, hold it in place while I get my washi that I'm using for my measurements in place. Because I want to get the washi lined up right against the card so that I'm making sure that every card is hitting at the right measurements. Just another little trick I've picked up along the way. Okay, so we've got it lined up. It should be right. Let's just go ahead and do it. So there is our bottom cut off. There's our cup. And look, borderless on the bottom. That already makes me happy. Even if we just did that, that would make me happy. Just getting rid of that clip art and this weird dots in the corner. Like, what is that? That's just excess design that doesn't need to be there. So now what we're gonna do real quick is just grab one of our other deck, and I'm gonna make sure that these measurements are gonna work for it. And if I'd have been smart, I'd have checked that before I made my first cut. But I do know that they're roughly in the same spot, so it should be fine. And thankfully it is. And of course I'm holding down all over the place just to make sure that that is not shifting my card as I cut. So there you can see I've got the bottom off of both of those. They are the same size, so that is awesome. So I'm going to follow that process, and I'm going to trim the bottom off of, well, 2 decks here, and then we'll check back in and take a look at what we're going to do on the top. Okay, so it has been about 15 minutes, so this whole process of trimming the bottoms went actually quicker than I thought it was going to, so you got to figure probably about 15 minutes per side times 2 decks, probably not too bad. This is a thinner cardstock, so the trimmer goes through it really easily. So you can see here that I have all of the majors, the wands, the cups, the pentacles, and the swords all have the bottoms taken off of them. So now what I need to do is contend with the tops. So first I need to find where any of those symbols, and it's going to be just in the quartz, I think, overlay the cards. I'm pretty sure that in my majors, none of the numbers go into the artwork. Nope, so that's fine. So we can do those last. And let's see, the queens. Let's just pull out quartz from each of these suits. Yep, so those ones don't run over, but these ones do. And these ones definitely run over. Okay, so none of the court cards in the Tarot of the Secret Forest actually run into the artwork, which is nice. So we're just contending with the fairy lights here, and they look like they're all about the same. Looks like they're all about the same. So let's just go with our pages. We'll use them to do our measurements. Okay, so we're basically going to repeat the process here. I'm going to, let's see, it is right here. So 1/2 inch should be right here. And it's actually on a line, isn't that nice? Gonna use the handy ruler. That looks like it should do it. Gonna use this washi to hold my card in place while I get my other washi down, although it is on a mark here, which is always nice. I like when I can line it up with a mark. The extra washi out of the way. So you can just make sure the card is going right there, and there's our cut it off perfectly. So now I have all of the tops and bottoms removed from the deck, and I think already it's looking fantastic. So now it's just time to trim off the sides, and I do believe, as I was looking through here, I think that the sides on the yes, the sides, oh, that's an issue. So we're gonna have to watch the printing. So kind of line up a couple of them here. Hopefully you can see. Need another, trying to not flip them around the wrong way because it does matter. It does matter. So let's see, I've got a handful. So this one's slightly off from this one. So it definitely looks like the Tarot of the Secret Forest has a little bit thicker border than the fairy light, so I think we'll use that one to start with. So basically I'm just gonna take off, you know, what I need. I don't want to cut off any extra. This is about a, I don't even know how much big that is, 1/8 of an inch maybe? I don't know. I'm not very good with measurements, which is amazing that this even comes out because I'm not very good with measurements. Okay, so let's see, if I go here, whoops, I'm banging things around. That is going to put me pretty close to the edge there. But let's just double check because I don't want to, I don't want to cut I want to make sure that my border is getting removed from my fairy lights as well. So that should be good. It should put me just on the other side of this little white line and just at the, I don't know if you can see it on camera, but the Tarot of the Secret Forest kind of has a very slight inner glow. And I put that right in the way, but we'll just try to use this. So we're gonna do this one. And I got all the black, but there's a little bit of the light down there, that little inner glow that I was talking about, and that's totally fine. That doesn't bother me at all. So let's just make sure my washi is straight. Check our fairy lights. And it's very important when you're doing just really kind of small sections like this to make sure that you are bringing your blade down straight and that you're not wonking it one way or the other. But so you can see both of those came out really well, and you can see like this is definitely going to be a pocket size deck by the time I'm done. So I think that I'm going to go ahead and finish up the trimming the deck all together. So I'm going to go ahead and trim up the right sides, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the left sides because it's basically the same process. We're just repeating it. And then I'm going to go ahead and corn around it because, you know, that's not really something that needs to be on camera. Just going to clip my corners probably with a medium. And then we'll check back in and talk about color for the edges. So I'm on day 2 of the modification of my Tarot of the Secret Forest and my Fairy Lights Tarot. And as you can see, I have finished trimming the entire deck and corner rounded it. And, you know, this is 2 decks, so that took me a little while, and I really just ran out of daylight. So I thought we'd just wait and come back again the next day and go ahead and work on edging it. So I wanted to do, some of these are upside down. I wanted to do this deck in a couple of different colors, mostly because there's so many of them. Like if I tried to do 2 decks all in one marker, it's probably not going to make it that far because, you know, most of my markers have already been through a couple of deck edgings. So I kind of grabbed a couple of colors just to start with that I thought might work, and I kind of made some swatches. Now you can see how bright these are going to be. So they're way too bright, I think, for these cards, and I'm definitely going to need to tone them down, but I can do that with the distressed ink. So even though I'm using these bright Crayolas, I'm still going to be able to get that kind of almost vintagey, dirty look, like really earthy look that these cards have. And I think that will be great to tie that in, but still be able to make use of my Crayolas, which go on quick and easy and are a great tool to use. Now I have heard from other people, and I have experienced myself, that some of the Crayolas, particularly the blues, reds, and greens, and occasionally the blacks, you will get transfer on your hands if you don't wipe them off really well right from the get-go. And sometimes you'll get some transfer even after that. And I think it depends a lot on the cardstock, on how well it actually takes the ink, and how well it actually absorbs it, or whether the ink just kind of sits on top of the cardstock. Generally, when you have a cut card, you're coloring into a raw edge, so it works usually pretty well. If you have an issue with that, doing the distress stamps over the top by giving it the rub with the distress ink, which we'll see here in a little bit, definitely hopes to kind of seal that ink in. And that is what I tend to do to kind of fill that in. But generally I find that as long as I wipe them down pretty good as I'm doing it, it tends to take care of the most of it, and the transfer that comes off of my hands is very minimal most of the time. It does depend on the cardstock, so please do keep that in mind if you are using the Crayolas for yourself. It's no different than the Sharpie blues and reds, which do have a tendency to transfer long after they have supposedly dried. It just kind of is the way that some ink works with some papers. You do have to remember these are coated. So these actually have like a lamination over the top of them, and some of them have a core in between the papers, and that's what gives them some of the stability. And that can affect the way your ink applies. Now, I am not an expert on card making by any stretch of the imagination. So this is just all from my personal experience. So please take that with a grain of salt. Nothing I say is gospel here. This is just my own kind of trial and error process. Hopefully it will work for you if you try this. It does work for most people, but there are those rare occasions that it just doesn't, it doesn't work out the way you thought it was going to. And that does happen with deck mods just in general. So I'm going to kind of throw that little disclaimer in there because I have gotten some messages from people who have had some issues with the Crayolas. I also get messages from people who have had issues with Sharpies, with stamps. Again, like I said, it depends on the card stock. They're all different. So to say that Crayola works great on one deck may not necessarily work on another. So do please keep that in mind. And I'm just going to throw that disclaimer in there. But we're going to try it and we're going to see how it goes. Like I said, I'm going to layer the distressed ink over the top of it, and that should help seal in the Crayola. These are washable markers, so there is a possibility that they will transfer off a little bit. Okay, so that little spiel aside, totally getting distracted with this project. Okay, so now that I have that, what I'm going to try to do is, rather than making tabs, I'm going to kind of just lay my markers out here and pile up cards next to them that I think might work with. If I would move these out of the way, would probably be helpful. Thinking blue here, blue, kind of liking the yellow for that one. Oops. And really this is just a matter of like personal preference. There's not, there's no science to this. It's just, I look at a card and go, that feels like it's, has more yellow, or that feels like it has more orange or blue or what have you. So there is no real rhyme or reason to it. It's just kind of an intuitive process, kind of a feeling thing. Like this one could go blue or green, right? And sometimes when I get cards like this, when I get down to the end, I just see which I have more of, and then I'll pull it into one or the other. So at this point, I'm basically just going to go through and edge each one in their colors. I will show you, just in case you haven't seen before, how I work with particularly the Crayolas, but even with the mild liners. Always the marker to the back of the card facing you, so that any runoff, if you get any, which you usually don't with Crayola, but goes onto the back of the card, not the front. And then it's just a matter of literally coloring your edges. Now, being that this is a green color, it will have a tendency to transfer off onto my hands if I don't wipe the excess off. And I even got a little bit of bleed on the front, which doesn't tend to happen, but so if you just run it along, and actually what I'm doing, just to let everybody know, is I'm actually using my finger to press the paper towel against the card, and then using my other two fingers to pinch to get anything off of the front or back. And that way I am maintaining contact all the way around the card, the front, back, and the side. And that wipes off any excess, and then I shouldn't get any transfer off on my hands. However, sometimes it does happen. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're working with, I would say Crayolas, but it happens with Sharpie too. Just those, your primary colors tend to have the most issue, sometimes your blacks as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. And so I'm going to go through and I'm going to edge all of these cards, and we'll come back and take a look when I'm done. Okay, so I have finished edging the whole deck, and I ended up doing a section of them in orange. So using the Crayola orange, just the basic Crayola. I did a section in this teal color. So there's that one in the Crayola teal. I did a section in the mild liner yellow. You see that there. Oops. I did a section in the Crayola blue. Again, these are just the regular Crayolas. A section in the Crayola red. Just your basic red Crayola. And you can tell probably in some of them that I only did one coat, so they're not like completely filled in, but that's because I'm actually going to run the distressed ink over the top. And so I don't really need to fill the whole thing in because I'm going to have the extra. Now I had originally planned to do this section in the mild liner green, but my mild liner green ran out like 4 cards in. So I just switched to the basic Crayola green and did that. It's a little bit different color than the teal, so I think that'll work out. So let's go ahead and put them all together now so that we can see how they look before I distress them. And I do still have both decks mixed in together. So here is all of our colors together. Turn it towards the light. And you can see it gives that nice pop of color on the sides when you fan them out. And I just think that looks really cool. The backs, of course, the Tarot of the Secret Forest has the black and white backs. And you can definitely see the pop of color on those, but that doesn't bother me. And the color does pop off the side of the Fairy Lights Tarot, but it's not quite as predominant as it is on the Tarot of the Secret Forest because, of course, that is a white background. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my vintage distressed ink vintage photo and I'm going to overlay it over my cards. Now there's a couple of different reasons that I do this. The first being that the Crayola markers are great because they go on real quick and easy, but they're a little bit bright, especially when you have some of these kind of muted tones and some of the darker hues that we have in some of these decks. Now some of them, like this one, the bright color looks really great on, as well as this one. But just to give the whole deck an overall kind of more earthy look, I'm going to go ahead and distress them. So I'm going to take a piece of my paper towel. And these are shop towels and they do work, they're a little bit more substantial and they work a little bit better than I think paper towels do. I buy these at Costco. Well, my husband buys them at Costco and I steal them out of the garage. But they do hold up a little bit better for this kind of work because they are kind of like, they're really strong and they're kind of like cloths. You can actually wash them. I've accidentally run them through the wash before. Wouldn't recommend it, but they do survive it. So they work really well for this kind of really kind of vigorous scrubbing that you're going to end up doing. So with this one, and I've done this before in a couple of different videos. If you check my Mod With Me series, and I also have a tutorial on this whole process. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each color, and that's a lot of cards to contend with. So I'm actually going to divide it into 2 piles because I want to get these as tight as I possibly can, and I'm going to have to rub off the excess. So I want to go at a pace that I can keep up with. So then I'm just going to take my paper towel, wrap it around my finger, and rub this on to darken that, to darken those colors. You can also do this 1 card at a time. Put that down so I don't get distressed ink on my table. And you could just very lightly run the distressed ink over each card at one time, but that does tend to put a little bit more of the ink on there and you may not want quite that much. Now I'm actually rubbing on quite a bit. You can also, if you're careful, do it this way as well, and then take your paper towel and kind of smoosh it out a little bit. If you do that, like I just did, you're going to end up with kind of areas where it's darker than others. And that may or may not be okay depending on the look you're going for. But because I've already started it, we're going to go ahead and go with it. So I'm just kind of tapping it on there. I'm not really rubbing it across. And then I'm going to blend it in with my paper towel. And that's really going to give me that kind of vintagey look to the edges of the deck, and it does also help seal the Crayola in. I know that some people have issue with the Crayola rubbing off. This kind of does help give a little bit of a protective coat over it. So I'm just kind of darkening these up really good, going over each section a couple times just to make sure that I have it looking kind of the way I want to. And then what we need to do is move that out of the way. And we need to take another piece of paper towel and we need to wipe off this excess because I did the cards together. It does bleed between the cards. However, distressed ink doesn't dry instantly, so you have plenty of time if you do smaller chunks like this to just go around and wipe the excess off. So being that I've trimmed these down to smaller cards, this is a pretty quick and easy process. Just going to clean them all up, and then I'm basically going to repeat this process through all of the other cards just to give it that vintagey look. So I'm going to finish this up and then we'll check back in at the end and see our completed deck mod. Okay, so I finished adding the distressed ink layer to the card, and you can see now, hopefully, put them into the light, that they are, if I could get them flat, there's so many of them here, that they have now kind of a darker tone to them in areas where the brown of the distressed ink is really picking up. Hopefully you can see that. Here's them all fanned out. Look at that. There's so many of them. It's kind of hard to hold, but look, they're a great size now. I love them. So let's go ahead and let's divide them back up into their related decks, which would probably be easier from the back. And then we'll give them a shuffle and see what they look like when we get them all mixed in. So now that they are all mixed in, oh look, you can see, so the Tarot of the Secret Forest had primarily red and green cards, which actually makes sense for this deck given the color tone of the deck. So there's lots of green and reds with a little bit of blue, yellow, teal, and orange mixed in. And then we can see here the fairy lights had much more of the orange, the teal, and the blue, which again makes sense for the color palette of the deck. Very much orange, blue, teal colors in this deck. So I think the colors came out really well in terms of matching the cards. All of those colors are also represented on the back, so that's really cool. Oop, we got a straggler. You belong over there. Okay, so let's go ahead and give each of the decks a shuffle, see how they look blended in. Look, there's like maybe 2, 3 green ones. That's kind of funny. So let's give them a shuffle and see how each deck looks blended in. And as you can tell, even though I trim them, they do still shuffle well because I use those measurements. If you want a deck that shuffles well trimmed, you need to use the measurements. I'm not saying it works for every deck, but it works for the majority of them. Okay, so there's that one. Let us do the Tarot of the Secret Forest. Get these mixed in here. Beautiful. Look at that nice mix. Look at all those colors. Isn't that pretty? You can see on the back, it definitely picks up the colors on the sides for the Tarot of the Secret Forest. But even like, look how pretty it so matches. I hope it picks up on camera. So that's the Tarot of the Secret Forest. And here is the fairy lights. Look at those all mixed in. I do have a chunk of blue right there, but that's okay. They look great with the backs, actually. The colors really match the backs of these cards really well. And of course, they match the front as well, too. Look how pretty. So now let's go ahead and lay out a few cards from each deck just so that we can see. They are, of course, a bit smaller now, but I do really like the size because I think it's really a great size for doing larger readings. I probably should have put the Tarot of the Secret Forest underneath. That could have been like the shadow, the what's going on underneath. And then the fairy lights could be what's going on above. Don't they look beautiful? Let's just do that just because that just sounds like that would make for a really, really beautiful reading with these two decks. So let's as I move things around. So let's go ahead and do a reading with the, can say as above. It's one of my favorite readings to do. Let's do 6 of them because they're small and we can fit 6. Put them all together. Look how they look together without the borders. It makes a story, which I think is really beautiful. And if you read with a deck intuitively, that works really well. So, oops, upside down. Some of them may be upside down because as I wipe it off, it doesn't, I don't necessarily get them all turned around correctly right away. So there we go. We have the as above, so below. Look how beautiful those are together. Gorgeous. So now one of the things that I tend to do with the Tarot of the Secret Forest is to utilize the backs. And I do have a video on this, but just because we're here playing with them, generally what I do is I take half the deck and I flip one side around the other way. So I'm actually shuffling half the deck in backwards. And that is going to give me that mix. So now we can pull out usually I like to shuffle these really well if I'm going to do this type of a situation with them. So now we could get some of those black and white ones in there as well. How beautiful. So even with the reverse side of the Tarot of the Secret Forest, it still looks beautiful together. And I am going to keep these 2 decks separate, even though I will probably use them together most of the time, just because I do want to keep some of the Tarot of the Secret Forest decks flipped around the other way, but I do want all my Fairy Lights Tarot to be flipped around the correct way. So there we have it, the Tarot of the Secret Forest and the Fairy Lights Tarot, completely trimmed and borderless into an intuitive deck, or really 2 intuitive decks that can be combined into one because they are the same size. So thank you so much for joining me for this mod with me. You will find the links for the decks and products that I've used in this video in the description box below, along with links for my deck modification tutorials and my Mod With Me playlist. I hope you enjoyed this process and will join me again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.